Welcome to Lunch with the Lord. I'm Pastor Mark. We're in Judges, and we're going to be starting chapter 9 this lesson. But before we begin, Jeremiah 15:16, Thy words were found, and I did eat them, and thy word was unto me the joy and the rejoicing of my heart. Now, as we finished last lesson, we see that we finished basically with the end life of Gideon after the war, what happened for the next, 40 years, and the birth of Abimelech, his mother, and they're from Shechem, and then Gideon dies, and then of course what happens after Gideon dies is they forget the Lord and they forget about Gideon. They show no respect or anything towards God who delivered them, or Gideon who was the means by which God delivered them. And now we come into chapter 9. Now, in this chapter, we will see the very nature of Satan expressed in a man. In Ezekiel chapter 28, verses 12 to 17, we see the design of God in his making of the archangel Lucifer. Lucifer was perfect in beauty, and the glory of the earth was his covering. But his own heart lifted itself up because of his beauty. His downfall was that he began to look at himself and not to look at God so much. In Isaiah 14, verses 12 to 14, Satan is now filled with pride of his own beauty, and he is overcome with the power that God had invested in him, and he decides to take over the throne of God. He promotes his plan to the other angels, and 1/3 of those angels decide to take his side in order to remove God from his throne and to establish Lucifer as the ultimate authority. And we see that in Revelation chapter 12, verse 4. His plan is to ascend into heaven and to exalt his throne above God and his angels, to sit in authority above the angels and above the affairs of mankind. And the end result is that Lucifer wanted to be like the Most High, having ultimate authority and ultimate rule over all things. He did not think that his attempt to usurp the throne of God would be the destruction of himself and of all those who would follow him. Now, for whatever reason, about Abimelech, for whatever reason to him, Abimelech is going to establish himself as the leader or the king over Israel. Like Lucifer was, it was because he looked at himself and saw that he was Gideon's son, or possibly that he was given a special name by Gideon that had reference to a king. Remember, his name Abimelech means father of a king. Whatever the reason was, we know that ultimately it was the pride that was in his heart, the same pride that was in Lucifer, that moved him to do this. And the result of pride in the heart will always cause the death and the destruction of not only the person that expresses it, but also of other people. Now, let's read verse 1. We're only going to be doing verse 1 in this lesson. And it says here, And Abimelech, the son of Jerubbaal, went to Shechem unto his mother's brethren, and communed with them, and with all the family of the house of his mother's father. Now, when a person desires to promote themselves above the rest, they always go to those people who will be most willing to support this move. Now, Abimelech goes home and he starts with his own relatives, and then he uses them to influence the rest of the people in his own hometown. Finally, like an ambitious politician, he starts to receive support financially, from which he begins his ascent to begin to rule. But Abimelech was not called by God to attain this position. Neither was there any reason for a judge or a deliverer to be raised up. The attainment of power was completely all of Abimelech's making. This rise to power that he wants to attain, this is all something that he wants to do within himself. Now, in my lessons on James chapter 4, verses 1 through 3, I mentioned that ultimately a majority of all the wars in the history of this world started, listen, they started in the sinful, greedy, lustful heart of only one person. It was one person who desired something that God had not chosen to give to them. So they desired to take it by force. You go back to all these wars, and I almost would guarantee you that most of the wars throughout all of the history of this world, going back 6,000 years until today, that the majority of the wars were started because one person had evil and sinful desires in their heart. They coveted something, they wanted something, and they got the people under them to agree with them, and then they got the military, so on and so forth. But it all started in the heart of one person. Now in James 4 verses 1 through 3, he says, "You have not, because you have not humbled yourself to ask God for it. And God chooses not to give it to you." Why? Because deep in your heart, you want to use that thing for your own glory and to satisfy your own lust. And that's exactly what's happened. Look at, when you go back to the World War I, World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War, what was it all about? People wanted something. Why didn't they just ask God for it? Just ask God. God is the ruler of the world. Let God decide whether you should get this thing or not. But instead of asking God, they don't ask God. Why? Because they want to consume this thing on themselves. And even if they do ask God for it, God's not going to give it to them because they want it for themselves. They want to satisfy their own fleshly desire, whether it's property, money, whatever, power, whatever it is. They don't ask God, and God's not going to give it to them anyways because it's a sinful desire. Abimelech is going to take what God never gave him, and he will directly disobey his father, Gideon. Gideon's desire. Gideon's desire was in chapter 8 in verse 23. Gideon said, when he was asked to be ruler and become a king over the nation of Israel, what did he say? He said, "I will not rule over you, neither shall my son rule over you." He said, "The Lord will rule over you." That was Gideon's desire. And now Abimelech is going to sin against Gideon's, his father's desire, and also against God himself, because God's not going to give him. God will give him 3 years as being ruler, but it wasn't God's will for him to be there. But there is one more important lesson that we can learn from verse 1, and that is that Shechem, the city of Shechem, sits almost in the middle of the promised land. It sits in a narrow valley between 2 mountains. Now, Mount Gerizim on the south and Mount Ebal on the north. Now, those 2 mountains sound familiar because we heard them back in Judges chapter 8, verses 30 to 35. Mount Gerizim was the mount of blessing. Mount Ebal is the mount of cursing. And Joshua leads the army. They go and they take Jericho, and then after Jericho they go to Ai. After Ai is defeated, then God takes them to the very middle of the promised land. And right there between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim is this area, and eventually Shechem is there. And they pronounce the blessings from Mount Gerizim. They pronounce the cursings from Mount Ebal. And on Mount Ebal, now listen, on Mount Ebal, God told Joshua to write down the law of Moses and on rocks and put it on Mount Ebal. Plus, there was an altar built to God on Mount Ebal. So when Joshua and the army left, there was on Mount Ebal, there was an altar unto God, and the law of God was written on Mount Ebal. And I think the reason why God did that was because God, what he was doing was he was going into the center of the land, and he was like putting a stake with a flag on it. How you shove it in the ground, this is my land. God was basically telling all the Gentile nations around, this land, I'm going to give this land to my chosen people, the Jewish nation. And this land will be ruled by my law. So God established his law right in the middle of the promised land, that land should be ruled by God and by his word. Now Baal worship is established in the promised land. And and the question is this: what has happened to those stones that the law was written on? Back in Joshua chapter 8, verse 32. What happened to those stones? And where are they? Still there? Were they destroyed by one of the oppressing nations? By the time of Judges here, in Gideon's time, in Abimelech's time, were those stones that the law was written on, were they still on Mount Ebal? And was the altar still there that we see in Joshua 8 verse 30? Was the altar still there that was built unto God? Did the Jews who had given themselves to worship Baal, did they dare to go up to the Mount Ebal and to destroy them? I mean, were they so much in love with Baal and so much rejecting God? Was it the Jews that went up to Mount Ebal and destroyed the altar and the law? Or no one knows. Or was it one of the oppressing enemies, like the Mesopotamians? Was it the Moabites? Was it the Midianites? Did some other oppressing nation go to that mountain and destroy those things? No one knows. But the 2 mountains that were to represent the blessings and the cursings for Israel, if they obey God's law, they have now been overshadowed by Baal worship. And this was a mockery unto God. God specifically had his law established in the very center of the land, saying, this land will be ruled by me and by my word. And now, years later, the Israelites are going to Shechem, right in the middle, and they are establishing Baal worship. Basically, they're rejecting God. They're shoving God out. They're basically telling God, we don't want you here anymore. We don't want your word anymore. We will establish what we want. And right in front of God's face, they establish Baal worship. Now, we're going to finish there, and we're going to continue on in verse 2 next lesson. But until then, walk with the Lord. I know he walks with you.